So yeah, thank you so much, Justin and Denise, for inviting me to come speak. I don't have anything written out that's like really formal. I thought I'd just talk about like how I got involved in student activism and why I'm interested in men's issues and men's human rights. So about like a year back, like in the beginning of 2015, I was very involved on campus with like trans-related activism, and I was very kind of involved in the social justice community on my campus. And it's there where I started kind of noticing the kind of anti-male bias and the harmful assumptions about men and their experiences, and how pervasive they were within the on-campus social justice circles. And they really went unquestioned. And then when I decided to kind of challenge and criticize these sentiments, I was vilified for it, and I was, called a misogynist and an anti-feminist and a bunch of other names, which now is I wear it with a badge on. It is then that I decided to kind of apostatize myself from these groups and started to begin the first steps of forming a men's issues club. And in kind of July, in the summer of last year is when I and a friend of mine started the SFU Advocacy for Men and Boys Club with the help of Cafe. And of all the stories I hear of such clubs trying to form, men's issues clubs trying to form, we had a relatively easy time, and I say relatively because it still was definitely more difficult than the average club to gain, official club status. When Denise invited me to come speak about, come speak at this event, and I heard it was called She for He, I obviously thought of what it was referencing, the He for She campaign. And it made me think back on when I was watching Emma Watson's speech about the He for She campaign, and how she kind of paid lip service to men's issues, very kind of superficially, but there seemed to be a promise that if men join kind of the feminist movement or the women's movement to address women's issues, they will kind of be rewarded by having their issues looked at as well. And then I dug a bit deeper and found that these were mostly empty promises and that there were no frameworks set up to actually address men's issues in this He for She. And it was just it was the age-old story of men helping women and men setting aside their issues, no matter how important and how pressing, for the sake of the greater good, and the greater good being women. So that really encapsulates my experience of how often men's issues are paid lip service, but then they're kind of put on the back burner, and then nothing really happens, and that really resembles my experience of the sentiments on campus. We'll eventually get to it, and then we never really end up getting to it. So the reason I decided to dedicate my work to men's issues and men's human rights is not because I care more about men. I care about men just as much, which I think is rare in today's society. When people may claim they care about men just as much as they care about women and trans people, but I think when it comes down to where resources go and what issues are paid attention to, I just don't think most people do. So that's why that's why I decided to dedicate my work on men's issues, because as a woman, as a trans woman, my voice is so crucial in this, and I find I don't mind being a tool for the men's movement, even though I know very well I won't be used as a utility. I don't mind being part of the toolkit with which we have to break through this cultural barrier when it comes to addressing men's issues. Having that said, when we were kind of communicating about what opening remarks, what my opening remarks should include, a few controversial assertions, and I have many to beg from because I don't mind running my mouth. But I like talking about the issue of trans misogyny. I fairly recently started looking at the idea of trans misogyny through the lens of men's issues and men's rights. And I realized that what trans misogyny really boils down to is misandry. Because when I'm, like, every time I've ever experienced transphobia and experienced violence or harassment or abuse for being trans, it was not because I was perceived as a woman, it's because I was perceived by the perpetrator as a broken man. That really made me understand that as trans women, we kind of tread a line between having female privilege of being taken care of and having our lives valued as women, and having kind of a social support network. Like for example, the other day I was in a dodgy area of town, and there was a guy who was mentally ill, and he was making very weird statements towards me. And right away there was a guy who came to my aid to protect me. If I were a man, I would have never received that. So ultimately, we kind of tread a very thin line between having female privilege and having neither female nor male privilege, and kind of being deemed to be
I think she's frozen.
and maybe you really have to be deemed as less than human. You have to be deemed a man to.
We are breaking up with you. Can you repeat that last assertion, because it sounded like such a cliffhanger? So, just the last thing that you were saying. So,
Sure.
Just saying in your the last sentence.
Sure. Where did you lose me at? Where did you lose me at?
I think you were talking about, it was just like a few seconds ago, so if you can just go back to where you were.
About 30 seconds.
Ago.
So where did you lose me at? Sorry.
Oh, you were in I think you were, someone had a man had come to your rescue.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So the other day, I was at night, I was in a dodgy part of town, and basically a guy who was definitely mentally ill made weird remarks on the street at me, and then right away a guy came to my rescue and made me veer him away and shoot him away. I would never receive that kind of social support, and that if I were a man. So my point was, us trans women kind of tread a line between having female privilege and having neither male or female privilege when we're perceived as men by perpetrators, and then we get deemed to be at the bottom rung of the social hierarchy, being deemed less than human. I mean, when you look at the violence that trans women face in today's society, absolutely horrific. You really have to be deemed as less than human. You have to be deemed a man to receive that kind of violence. So that was my point. And then I continued on. So yeah, that's kind of where I come from. And then I also have another kind of controversial opinion that I take is that I kind of object to the kind of disdain the disdain with which we perceive the term manner, because I actually, if used correctly, I don't think the term manner is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, instead of ceasing to tell instead of ceasing to tell boys to man up, we should come up with a gender-neutral term that kind of captures the essence of that sentiment and employ it evenly and within good reason to both boys and girls. Because reminding a child that their feelings aren't always, each and every opportunity and circumstance, the centre of the universe is actually a good thing. It avoids breeding a generation of narcissistic, self-obsessed, solipsistic, selfish, and unempathetic brats. But I think that might be too late. Sometimes emotions do need to be set aside to get shit done. And that's definitely an important thing to instill into our children, within good reason, of course. So yeah, that's where I come from. Other than that, yeah, that's kind of what I prepared. I don't have anything too formal. Yeah.
That's good.
If you look at the history of the gender roles, they've never been about competition. It's very unnatural. Like, gender roles have always been, you know, complementarianism and male-female cooperation. But we have seemed to have come to a point where it seems to be a bit of a gender war mentality. How we came here is kind of debatable. And I don't think it's a zero-sum game when it comes to raising awareness and getting people to think about these issues. I don't think the more we think about men's issues, the less we can think about women's issues. However, I feel like something like government funding is finite. It is kind of a zero-sum game then, in the sense that when we start actually giving like legitimate amounts of government funding to men's issues like domestic violence shelters, money will have to be compromised elsewhere, whether it be, you know, for women's issues, or whether it be for the environmentalist sector of where government funding goes. And there will always be a special interest group lobbying against that. And that's a tough game. That is a very difficult battle to fight, is trying to get that kind of assistance.